If someone said they were turning Kratos into a gay black transvestite just to make a statement, most fans would roll their eyes, not because of diversity, but because it has nothing to do with the story. Every time a game comes out now, the same debate starts. It's too woke, or you just hate representation. But the truth is, it's not that simple. Some games already did diversity well, and no one complained. We're not going back to the pre-2015 gaming. The people making the games are a part of the same creative industries as Hollywood and Silicon Valley.
Yes, yes.
So social commentary is here to stay. The problem isn't that it's there, it's how it's being handled. Before the discourse, before the hashtags, before the trailers that felt like TED Talks, there was a time when games spoke through story and not slogans. Back then, diversity wasn't a bullet point. It was a byproduct of world building. Writers didn't start with identity, they started with theme, power, control, freedom, redemption, revenge, the things that make us human, not just categorized. BioShock Infinite didn't sell itself as a game about racism. It sold itself as a game about a man with a debt and a girl in a tower. But once you stepped into Colombia, the message was everywhere, in the statues, the propaganda, the segregated bathrooms. You didn't need Elizabeth to turn to the camera and say, "This is wrong." You felt it, you saw it, and you lived it. When the game finally revealed its twist, that Booker and Comstock were the same man, it wasn't just clever, it was devastating. A commentary on guilt, violence, and the American myth. Metal Gear Solid was never subtle, but it was never preachy either. Kojima's writing was chaotic, theatrical, and deeply political, but it never felt like it was trying to win Twitter points. Whether it was MGS2 deconstructing player agency and digital control, or MGS3 exploring loyalty and the betrayal in the Cold War, the series tackled identity, ideology, and legacy without turning Snake into a mouthpiece. He was a soldier, a pawn, a man trying to survive a system that didn't care about him, and that made him relatable, not because of who he was, but because of what he endured. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a masterclass in quiet storytelling. Arthur Morgan isn't a progressive icon. He's a dying outlaw trying to make sense of a world that's leaving him behind. And the game doesn't shove diversity in your face. It lets you find it. In the stories of Charles Smith, a Native American fighting for dignity, and Sadie Adler, a widow who becomes a gunslinger, not because it's empowering, but because it's the only way she knows how to survive. The characters aren't defined by their labels, they're defined by their losses. And then there's God of War, the original trilogy. Kratos is rage incarnate, a man so consumed by vengeance that he kills gods, titans, and fate itself. But beneath the blood and chaos is a story about grief, about a father who failed, about a man who can't forgive himself. Kratos isn't masculine because the devs wanted to make a point. He's masculine because the story demands it. His brutality isn't aspirational, it's tragic. These games didn't avoid representation. They didn't just center it. They didn't flatten characters into symbols. They let them breathe. They let them contradict themselves. They let them be messy. And maybe that's the real difference. Today, we often get characters who are defined by what they represent. Back then, we got characters who were defined by what they wanted and what they were willing to sacrifice to get it. Games didn't need a press release to tell you they had a message. You just felt it. Around the mid-2010s, something in the gaming industry shifted. It wasn't that just developers started caring more about representation, it was studios realized representation could be monetized. Diversity became a selling point, not a storytelling choice. Once the marketing departments got involved, the soul of the narrative began to fracture. Suddenly, trailers weren't showcasing gameplay mechanics or emotional stakes, they were showcasing demographics. Press interviews stopped discussing character arcs and started celebrating first. The first trans character in a shooter. The first black woman in a fantasy RPG. The first non-binary protagonist in a sci-fi setting. These milestones weren't inherently bad, but they were treated as headlines, not narrative elements. And when identity becomes the product, storytelling suffers. Battlefield 5 is the textbook example. The game's marketing campaign leaned heavily into the inclusion of women on the front lines, framing it as a bold progressive move. But the execution fell hollow. The trailer emphasized optics over authenticity. And when fans questioned the historical accuracy or the tonal fit, EA responded not with nuance, but with condescension, telling critics to accept it or don't buy the game. Many didn't. The backlash wasn't about the presence of women. It was about the sense that the game was preaching rather than immersing. Forspoken followed a similar trajectory. The premise, a young black woman transported into a magical world, had potential, but the writing collapsed under the weight of its own self-awareness. The game wanted to be modern and diverse, but forgot to be believable. It didn't trust its world to speak for itself, so it overcompensated with quips and meta commentary that alienated more than it engaged. Then there's Dustborn, a game that aspires to be socially conscious, tackling themes like misinformation, oppression, and identity, but the world feels engineered for activism, not immersion. Characters speak in slogans. Dialogue reads like a manifesto. It's not that ideas are wrong, it's that they're delivered like a lecture. The player isn't invited to explore or interpret, they're instructed. This is the core problem with the corporate turn. When marketing teams begin speaking louder than the writers, the narrative loses its heartbeat. Characters become symbols, stories become statements, and games become platforms for messaging rather than vessels for meaning. Representation, when treated as a checkbox, loses its emotional weight, becomes performative, predictable, and hollow. And players, regardless of their background, can feel the difference. They don't reject diversity, they reject being sold a message instead of being told a story. The irony is that many of these games are built by talented, passionate teams, but when the creative process is filtered through PR departments and investor decks, the authenticity dies. The result is a game that looks inclusive on paper but feels disconnected in practice. If the corporate turn was the moment marketing hijacks storytelling, the echo chamber effect is what happens when writers stop writing for the audience and start writing for themselves. Most game developers today live in progressive urban tech circles. Their social environments, Slack channels, Discord servers, studio lounges are filled with people who share similar values, politics, and cultural references. That's not inherently a problem, but when those circles become the default lens for storytelling, the result is a creative bubble. One where relatable means relatable to my friend group and not relatable to the world. This is where self-insertion creeps in, not in the literal sense of putting yourself in the game, but in the subtler form of projecting your worldview onto every character, every line of dialogue, every emotional beat. The assumption is simple: if this feels normal to me, it must feel normal to everyone, but it doesn't. Take Insomniac's Spider-Man. Mary Jane Watson was once the charismatic, outgoing heart of Peter Parker's life, a character defined by charm, spontaneity, and emotional depth. In the reboot, she's reimagined as a hardened journalist with the same haircut and personality as the game's lead writer. Her grit replaces her warmth. Her assertiveness replaces her vulnerability. The intention was to make her stronger, but the result is a character who feels less like MJ and more like a projection. She's not written to serve the story, she's written to reflect the writer. Or look at Saints Row 2022. The original games were chaotic, crude, and deeply satirical, a celebration of friendship, absurdity, and reckless freedom. The reboot replaces that energy with a sanitized cast of internet archetypes, quirky, diverse, and painfully self-aware. It's the worst kind of relatable. Characters designed by people who think being awkward and terminally online is universal. The result isn't offensive, it's forgettable. And then there's Alan Wake 2. Barry Wheeler, the original comic relief and emotional anchor, is replaced by a new black female FBI agent. On paper, this is not a problem, but the change feels less like a narrative evolution, but more like a branding decision. It's not about what the story needs, it's about what the studio wants to signal. And when diversity choices are baked into the PR before gameplay, they feel hollow. This isn't about race, gender, or sexuality. It's about intent. When characters are written to reflect the writer's social circle rather than the emotional logic of the story, they lose their universality. They become avatars of ideology, not vessels of meaning. The irony is that the gaming audience is more diverse than ever. Global, multilingual, multicultural, but instead of writing for that audience, many studios write for their internal Slack threads. They assume that their worldview is the default, and that assumption kills authenticity. Representation isn't the problem, self-insertion is. When developers write characters they find relatable, assuming everyone else will too, they flatten the emotional spectrum of the game. They replace complexity with comfort. They trade risk for recognition. If the last decade has taught us anything, it's that representation alone doesn't make a story compelling. What matters is how it's used, whether it's woven into the emotional logic of the world or stapled onto the surface like a marketing badge. And when it works, you don't even notice the diversity, you notice the character. Take Final Fantasy XIII. Saz isn't memorable because he's black. He's memorable because he's a father, a man carrying the weight of his son's fate while cracking jokes to keep himself from falling apart. His identity isn't a statement, it's a context, and that context deepens his arc, not defines it. Fang and Vanille too are coated with queer undertones, but the game never turns into a spectacle. Their bond is emotional, tragic, and quietly powerful. It's not about labels, it's about love. Or look at the original Mass Effect and Dragon Age. These games offer same-sex relationships, non-binary characters, and complex cultural backgrounds, but they never feel forced. That's because writing starts with personality, not politics. Liara isn't compelling because she's an alien who can romance anyone. She's compelling because she's awkward, brilliant, and emotionally guarded. Dorian in Inquisition is openly gay, but his arc is about family, rejection, and personal pride, and the cost of being different in a rigid society. These stories resonate not because they're inclusive, but because they're human. And then there's Nier Replicant, where Kaine is intersex, but you wouldn't even know that unless you dug into the lore. The game doesn't announce it, it doesn't center it, it lets her exist. What defines Kaine is her rage, her trauma, her bond with the protagonist. Her identity is a part of her backstory, not her personality. And that's why it works. She's not a symbol, she's a survivor. Even in The Last of Us Part 2, for all of its controversy, commits to an emotional logic. Ellie's queerness isn't a twist, it's a truth. Her relationship with Dina isn't framed as progressive, it's framed as fragile, intimate, and doomed by the world around them. The game doesn't ask you to applaud their love, it asks you to mourn it. These examples share one thing. They don't treat diversity as a destination, they treat it as a detail, a thread in the tapestry, not the whole canvas. And because of that, the representation feels earned, it feels real. The best kind of wokeness doesn't need to tell you what it's doing, it just is. When writers focus on character motivation, emotional stakes, and world logic, identity becomes a natural part of the story, not a distraction, not a debate, just another facet of the human experience. And that's the blueprint, not less inclusion, better integration. If the problem is projection, the solution is perspective. The gaming industry doesn't need fewer progressive ideas, it needs better writers. Writers who understand that identity is not a substitute for character, and that representation means nothing without emotional truth. The fix isn't to retreat from inclusion, it's to integrate it with intention. First, writers need to start with humanity, not hashtags. A character's race, gender, or sexuality should inform their experience, not define their personality. Motivation comes first. Struggle comes first. The question should always be, what does this person want? Not what demographic do they represent? Second, studios should hire cultural consultants for accuracy, not optics. Too often, consultants are brought in late, used to rubber stamp decisions that had already been made. But the real consultation means listening. It means asking hard questions about how a character's background affects worldview, their relationships, their choices. It's not about avoiding backlash, it's about earning resonance. Third, test stories with varied audiences, not just internal staff. If your writing team is made up of people from similar backgrounds, your feedback loop will be limited. You'll think that your characters are relatable because everyone around you relates to them, but the world is bigger than your Slack channel. Broader testing doesn't mean watering down the story, it means stress testing its emotional logic. Fourth, stop announcing diversity as a selling point. Let it speak for itself. When a trailer leads with the first non-binary protagonist, it sets up the expectation that identity is the main event. But when diversity is embedded in the world, in the relationships, and the stakes, the players notice without being told, and that's when it feels real. Finally, encourage creative risk-taking that isn't politically calculated. Some of the best stories come from uncomfortable places, from contradictions, from failures, from characters who don't fit cleanly into an ideological box. Writers should be allowed to explore those spaces without fear of being labeled problematic or regressive. Progress doesn't come from safety, it comes from honesty. You can be progressive and still tell a damn good story. The two aren't mutually exclusive. The goal isn't to erase identity, it's to elevate it through character, through conflict, through consequence. When representation is earned, it doesn't feel like a lecture, it feels like life. Wokeness in games isn't the disease, it's a symptom of an industry that's lost its balance between message and meaning, between identity and humanity, between marketing and art. The real issue isn't that games are inclusive, it's that they've become self-congratulatory. That storytelling has been replaced by signaling that characters are written to be admired, not understood, and that shift has consequences. When developers write for applause instead of immersion, they flatten the emotional spectrum of their stories. When studios prioritize optics over authenticity, they alienate the very audience they claim to represent. And when the identity becomes the headline, the character beneath it disappears. This isn't just about politics, it's about craft. Great storytelling is universal, it's messy, it's contradictory, it doesn't fit neatly into a press release. It challenges the player, not just ideologically, but emotionally. It asks questions without giving answers. It creates space for interpretation. It's not just affirmation. That's what we're losing. Not the ability to include diverse characters, but the ability to write them well, to embed them in the worlds that feel lived in, to give them arcs that matter, to let them fail, grow, and surprise us. The solution isn't regression, it's maturity. It's time for writers to stop preaching and start listening, to stop projecting and start observing, to stop writing for their timelines and start writing for the world. Because when they do, something incredible happens. Gamers stop arguing about politics and start talking about what really matters to us. Great stories. We don't need less wokeness, we need better writing.